And it's really a pleasure to be here tonight. On the invitation of Carol Summerfield, who's a longtime friend and colleague. So it's really a gift to be able to be here with you all at the Lake Forest Lake Bluff History Center. I'm also really pleased to be a part of this series. The idea of looking at the US at 250 through local history is just in the center of my wheelhouse. This is what I think is the way at history coming and going. And I suspect I'm in a room full of people that agree with the idea that local history is the way to go up and tell the story in a big way. So I want to make those connections tonight between the local and the broader US history. I was at a session at the Organization of American Historians that met here in Chicago last spring, and there were a number of teachers in the audience, and teachers who actually teach Chicago history and local history in their classes. And one of them came up to me afterwards, somebody that I had met before, but I was asking him how his teaching history was going, and he just said, "Local history is my superpower." And every time I get ready to do almost anything now and think about history, I remind myself that local history is a superpower, and we can use it to tell all kinds of stories that are hard to tell, are harder to tell, or are complicated to tell it on a national level. We can dig down and really get at people and how people are involved in the past and how they interacted. Okay, so the title of this talk is Land to Real Estate, Northeastern Illinois during the Treaty Era, 1795 to 1833. So I'm the person that's doing the piece of your series in the founding era. So I've been trying to think about that the last couple of days, in particular about what I've chosen to talk about and then how that fits into your series. I know Rose Miron spoke first to you about Indigenous, the region in the Indigenous era. And you know a little bit about it, the Indigenous Chicago Project, I suspect, and you know that there's lots of amazing work being done on that. Where I want to key in is to talk about a time period that we're familiar with through, is this my, yes, just yell if I'm okay.
Breathe, pull it down.
Yeah, thank you. I'm like, you don't need to hear me breathe. Sorry about that. It's Thomas Jefferson. So we all are celebrating the Declaration of Independence, certainly this year. The document, or the document that I really focus in on, that Thomas Jefferson had a fundamental part in, is the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. He wrote a draft of that in 1785, and he's really a force behind that piece of legislation. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Northwest Ordinance. So we're going to go big. We're going to talk about the US story. And then I want to come back and talk about how that fits into this region. So that's my general plan of attack here. And just to give you a sense of the timing on all of this, I mean, this is coming, then the Northwest Ordinance comes between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So it's an important piece of the story that fits in there. And it's a founding document that you probably don't think much about. And I have been teaching this for 35 years now. And I have a colleague who, when I come back from my class on the Northwest Ordinance, he says, "You did it again. I can tell you've got that look on your face." I am an apostle for the Northwest Ordinance being an incredibly important thing for us to all know and to think about alongside of the Declaration. Anyway, at the end of the talk, you can tell me whether or not I've made any kind of a convincing case that we need to be thinking about it in that way. All right, so let me say a little bit about the Northwest Ordinance. There are several components to it. First off, we think about it, a part of it is tied to the land ordinance of 1785, but at its core, this is the United States, again, as the Confederacy, before we have a federal government, as a Confederacy making decisions about what the future of the United States is going to look like. And there are some key parts of the Northwest Ordinance that I think are particularly interesting. One of them, and probably the one that tips off to my title, is that it creates a process by which the United States is going to take land, subdivide it, and sell it to individuals. So it's the process by which the United States will take on, will move westward. And I think that's, again, it's embedded in the Land Ordinance of 1785, as well as the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. So there are pieces to this, but if you can keep that in mind, we all live with this, right? I mean, this grid is our landscape. And so if we think about this grid, this is, if you think about a piece of property that you know, if you look at the description of that property, it goes right back here. You know, I mean, your property is tied directly to this piece, this legislation that, again, is passed in the Confederacy. It will be repassed, in fact, once we get a federal government, to make sure that it maintains its status as a legal frame, and it is a frame for moving westward. So if we get the township grid, we get this survey. This is in contrast to a meets and bounds system, METE and bounds, BOUNDS, which is somebody going out and surveying with going out and just from this rock to that tree to the base of the, I don't know, whatever it is. And if you think about Kentucky, I don't know if you know anything about Kentucky land issues, but Kentucky is just one morass of competing claims for the same piece of property, right? I mean, so you couldn't get land claims settled in Kentucky until close to the end of the 19th century for much of the land. If you think about Abraham Lincoln's father, one of the reasons why land claims are all at a base of why people are leaving. Different in the Northwest Territory. Once you've got this set up, you know where a piece of property is. This ignores anything, it's going to ignore Lake Michigan, big piece. It ignores mountains, it ignores rivers. It lays this grid over a landscape. And again, you guys know, we know this grid from our real estate. We know it from our streets. We know it from looking from how high are we when we're in a plane, 35,000 feet or whatever it is that we see the grid imposed on the landscape. Okay, so land into real estate. Big piece of what this does. Is that important for Thomas Jefferson? You bet. This is a guy whose father was a surveyor. This is a guy who makes his money. I mean, there's lots of issues we can talk about with other things that Thomas Jefferson did, but he was interested in Western lands and making money in surveying and purchasing land and selling land. Okay. But it's not just this process. The Northwest Ordinance includes some pieces that I just want us to remember are here before we get a constitution. So this is the national government saying that every new state that's going to come into the Northwest Territory will come in on an equal footing. I know this doesn't seem revolutionary, but think about it. For the 13 original colonies, their experience is to be colonies. And here, this is saying, we're not going to have colonies. We're going to have equal states coming in so that when Ohio comes into the Union, it'll be on the same footing as Rhode Island. This is a big deal. And it's a part of the story that we can think about. We'd spend a lot of time on. I like the idea of compact. It's the very last couple of lines of this, the idea that they're creating a compact. I think about the Northwest Ordinance as a compact, a frame of government. Okay, this one is the piece that we're going to be spending the rest of much of our time with today, and that is religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and to the happiness of mankind. Schools, and schools is really interesting. Section 13 of every one of the townships that's surveyed in the Northwest Territory is dedicated to schools, to public schools. So it's the first time that we're really seeing a concerted effort to support public schools in this new United States. And again, it's coming in this time period when we're just after the revolution is over, and we're thinking about what's going to change here. And then we get the means of education shall, however, be, again, encouraged. Really interesting discussion that we can have there, but this is, I want to get to the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. And this idea of the indigenous people who are here, there's an acknowledgement in the middle of this Northwest ordinance that this land is not empty, that this land is actually controlled and has been controlled by indigenous people from sometime in the past right up to the present. So there is not an ignorance of the fact that this land is controlled by other people, not by the United States government. But it's here, and they're saying what? They say, we say, the folks who drafted this and affirmed it, that the utmost good faith shall always be observed towards the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. Hang on to that. That's a really interesting piece of this. And again, it's a vision for what the future is going to be like. Whether the U.S. will actually follow through on, well, you already know this. I'm getting this from the reaction here. You've got it. At any rate, we will continue and we'll swing back to this. One other piece of the Northwest Ordinance that may be most familiar to you is the fact that slavery is not allowed within the Northwest Territory. Now, there was slavery, enslaved people living in the Northwest, in the territory that becomes the Northwest Territory. And that's a complicated story. So when we say there was no slavery, an institution of slavery in the Northwest Territory, you have to say, well, yes, but, and there's lots and lots of stories here and ways in which enslaved people are a part of this story as well. But our frame then that comes out of the revolution that Thomas Jefferson has his hand in is a really interesting one. It's a one based in real estate. It's one that affirms education, that affirms good relations with indigenous people, that calls for the institution of slavery to not be a part of this story. It's a really interesting place to start. It's also going to have within this, the affirmation of freedom of religion. There's, again, we're before the Bill of Rights. There are all kinds of pieces here in the Northwest Ordinance that I think are just really very interesting and important for us to be thinking about. Okay, so that's the backdrop for thinking about what actually takes place on the ground in this area during this time period. So if I can go back, I'm going to swing back and do that. And then what I'd like to hear from you, if we can at the end, is what do you think of the combination of these two? Since that's what we're trying to do, is think about US history and local history together and how this fits. I've been wrestling this for a long time. One of the things I will say as I start here is that the Ken Burns series on the Revolution, I think, has done us a favor. I often have tried to talk about indigenous stories and the stories of Potawatomi, the Potawatomi in this region at the time of the Revolution and after. And there is kind of a sense of all the action was on the East Coast. And I think in an important way, we should be affirming, and I think we get at least an acknowledgement of it in the Revolution series in Ken Burns, that you have to look from the West as well. You have to look east from the West as well to understand what's going on in this time period. And some of you may be familiar with the work of Daniel Richter, who writes a book called Facing East from Indian Country, but that's one of a whole series of books that are written about thinking about our region, the West, in the revolutionary period and the period just after the revolution. Okay, so what do I want to say about this? I want to look particularly at the story of the Potawatomi. This gives you a sense of what I want you to have in mind is Indian villages, Potawatomi, Ottawa, Ojibwa, Ottawa, Potawatomi, the Abenaki people, are all living in this region. Again, I'm sure you've got a piece of this from Rose's talk last time. A couple of points here that I think are important is that these are villages of can be upwards of 100, even a couple of hundred people, but they're mostly summer villages. So what's being mapped here are summer villages. They're villages around farm fields. So these are farmers. Women are farmers in this region, the Algonquian women. They're going to be raising maize, so corn, beans, and squashes. And they will be doing that in this time of the year into then the end of the harvest in the fall. Those villages break up then in the wintertime into smaller units for hunting and then fishing and then maple syruping in the spring, so that there's a cycle, a rhythm to this, so that these villages wouldn't be necessarily there right now in March. They would be, or April. They would be something that you would see people beginning to return to these villages at that point. What are the Potawatomi? Potawatomi do not own this land. So that's the other part of this map, in the sense of they don't hold title. That takes us down to what the Northwest Ordinance said about how titles and people were going to claim land and own it. So the ownership here is of resources and control of land. It's not the land itself. And that can move. People are moving from one time of the year to another. So they're not in the same, it's not property. It's resources that are being exploited here. And so there's a very different vision of this world than we've got. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit here, is what that means. So my background on this is I started my story, when I started my dissertation, I started in 1830. So I ignored this entire story before 1830, was just, I started when Chicago became a real estate deal. When land became real estate was when I started to study this. And it's only over time. And I worked on the Encyclopedia of Chicago with Carol. And over that period of time, I learned a great deal from people like Helen Tanner, who's done some remarkable work that has been now just re-envisioned and newly energized by the work of the Indigenous Chicago Project at the Newberry. There are new books that keep coming out on this region, and two books that I rely on very much. One by Stephen Kantrowitz, who teaches at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, is on the Ho-Chunk, and the Ho-Chunk claim into the Chicago area, and in fact still have they have a hold in the south suburbs. So when I'm giving a talk in the south suburbs, people will be able to point out the places where the Ho-Chunk are running agencies, actually it's a sports arena in the south suburbs. The other book is by John Nelson, who's I think a Texas Christian and his book is much more about the Potawatomi, and it's called Muddy Ground. Both of these books are in the last since 2020, since the in the last 4 or 5 years. And both of these books are really helpful for you if you're thinking about what's going on in this time period, the Revolutionary era, before or after. Okay. So what does this look like? What does this world look like? I'm going to give a little bit of a snapshot here. One, we want to keep in mind that there's a specific geography to any place that you're going to pick up and look at, right? So when I start local history, I always start with what's the landscape look like? And there are two features in this landscape that I think are really important for thinking about how the Potawatomi are going to fit into this story. One is that we're at a continental divide. It's a water divide between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. The dotted line is the continental divide, between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River. That's the traditional, that is where the continental divide was before we started mucking with the waterways in the 19th century. The second thing that we're at is we're at a break point between the forests of the eastern woodlands and the prairie of the west. And so Chicago, the Chicago area is, and the Potawatomi then, who controlled this region with their allies during the late 18th century. This is an area that is an important crossroads, which means that it's a place of trade. It's a place where people are coming through. It's important even before we're going to get to the story of Chicago and the region's rise in the 1830s and 1840s as the place that we know it. So there are three big groups that we can think about. They all share some characteristics. The Ho-Chunk, though, are coming out of the West. They're Siouan speaking. Oh my gosh, Robert Morrissey, who's down at the University of Illinois, has also written another book just recently called The People of the Ecotone. And just like the worst title ever, but it's a great book. And I'm sorry, Robert, I don't really mean to be as, yeah, no, it is. It's a terrible book, terrible title, really good book. Miami, or the Three Fires, the Potawatomi people, all three of them then are going to compete for this region. And the way to think about this is control of resources, not they're claiming boundaries and land and property. This is not territory that we have boundary lines between in the way that we would be thinking about this from a Euro-American perspective. So this is Kantrowitz's view from what work he has done on what the Ho-Chunk territory looks like in the mid-18th century, and the claims particularly into the Chicago area. And then this is Nelson's view of thinking about this region in the mid-18th century. So when we're looking at this from that standpoint. So we kind of have to mesh these stories together from these different groups. But what we should see, we should have a sense of this is a place where there are many different people who are living here, having competing claims on the region. We want to think about what this has meant during the colonial period. So from the 1660s, 70s through the mid 18th century and into the early 19th century. So what this region has been is a trading. It's a trading region. When the French come in, when the British come in, when the Spanish are off on the side, when the Americans first come in, what they're interested in is trading with indigenous people who live in this area. So the beaver is of critical importance to this story, but it's not the only thing that's being traded. But that trading means that it's being done, this trading is being done in an indigenous landscape. It's an Indian world. This is a world that is not controlled by the French or the British who claim it, or the Americans who claim it when they're writing the Northwest Ordinance. This is territory that's controlled by indigenous people and with competing claims. So that's I think the important piece that I take away from this. So you get to maps like these that give you a sense of, hey, there's the French control this region before the Treaty of Paris before the French and Indian War in 1763. And yet, yes, you can say that, but I think it's more important to say the French are involved in trade with the indigenous people in this region, and they claim this territory in contrast to other European countries. They don't hold this land. So that's I think for my mind, that's the important thing to keep in mind. After the Treaty of Paris, the French are out of the story. The French traders who've come here, that's TRADERSs, some of them will also be seen as traders with the T, but that's a little later in the story. So the British come in and they just are overlaid onto this, and they too will be a part of this trading network with indigenous people in this region for resources in this region for goods that are coming in from outside. And these are some of the spots that were the trading outposts for this region by the mid to late 19th century. Some of them go back to the French, some of them are British. they're often just overlaid one on top of each other. And then the Americans come in after that. And that's the way I think about this region. And so when we get someone like George Winter, I hope some of you know, if you don't, you want to make a trip, the Tippecanoe Historical Society down in along 65 down near Purdue has an amazing collection of George Winter paintings, and they're of the Potawatomi in this era. A lot of them are also available online. Purdue's done a nice job of digitizing things, so you might want to take a look at them. But this, to my mind, embodies what I'm trying to explain about this is not a French world, not a British world, not an American world. This is an indigenous world that certainly has been shaped by generations of interactions with French, British, Americans, Spanish, but it's not French, it's not British, it's not American, it's an indigenous place. And I work with students to get them to think about this is just the way clothing. So cloth is an enormously important trade item that the Potawatomi and their allies want for clothing, but they're not going to dress like men and women in London or even in New York City. They have their own approach to what they're going to do with cloth, with the iron pots, with the knives, with the, again, you get a sense of this. This is creating something new, an indigenous world in this way. Okay, so just a couple of examples of people that fit into this picture. Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. So we don't know what Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable looks like other than one description of him as a handsome Black man. And the wonderful story about this is that the sculptor who does this, and this sculpture is just on the northeast side of the DuSable Michigan Avenue Bridge today. And if you had been in Evanston for a few years, they had a version of this, an enormous bust of this in front of the library. And then I understand it's been up in Mackinac now for the last year or so. At any rate, the sculptors decided that he had to create a handsome Black man, so he had a son sit for him for this sculpture. So it's a fanciful view, but it's one that, at any rate, speaks to Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. Who is he? He is out of this indigenous world. What we know of him is he is a French. He has a mixed descent, French and African. He may well be. His mother may well have come from Haiti. And that's coming from oral traditions tied with what little written word we've got on him. Why is he important to the story? He comes to Chicago as a trader, Trader. He's also going to be treated as a traitor by the Americans and the British during the American Revolution, because he's not really interested in one side or the other winning, because the traders, Traders in this world want to maintain this indigenous country, right? They don't really, if the Americans win in particular, this indigenous world of trade may well disappear. So if they have a horse in the race, it's to go with the British, but we'll do whatever we can to keep trade going. And that's Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable. He comes to Chicago after the American Revolution and founds a trading outpost on the north side of the Chicago River. So again, about where his statue sits now, and built up a trading empire. And he does this by marrying into an indigenous family. He has an indigenous wife, Potawatomi, possibly Illini, but we know that that together they build up a trading outpost. Why is that important? Because the trading connections made through your family are of critical importance. So French men and then British men married indigenous women, and these were by choice on both sides, that they were choosing to make these alliances because they were not only family alliances, but economic alliances and trading alliances. And they're the glue then for this region of an indigenous world. Okay. The person next door to Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, I can cannot go without at least mentioning her name. Archangel Wilmette, also a mixed descent. The village of Wilmette is named after her because her family gets a substantial land grant in the 1820s from the U.S. government but she is of Potawatomi and French descent. Her father was a French trader. Her mother was a Potawatomi woman. She grew up at a village near the Lake Calumet, and they come to live next door to Jean-Baptiste Point-du-Sable. And the Wilmettes, Archangel Antoine, will go on and live there long after Jean-Baptiste Point-du-Sable has left, and will stay into the 1830s, which is where our story ends. So this is fanciful again. She is dressed in large measure as a Dakota woman. This is Dakota regalia. It's done in the 1930s. It was in the WPA, by the WPA. It was in the post office in Wilmette. It's now the Wilmette Historical Society. But we do know that it's drawn from a picture of her daughter and descriptions of her as a very large woman, a very imposing woman, who is also very kind. She was very interested throughout this whole story of making connections as a neighbor, but those neighborly connections worked for her also economically, right? She was interested in keeping those trade connections going. All right, so if I can switch again here, now we're back to, we can talk about how the US comes into this. We've got the Northwest Ordinance going. We've got this over here. We've got the Potawatomi and their allies in this region. So we've got something of a problem because we've got this map laid out by the Northwest Ordinance of what's going to happen. And we've got Potawatomis in a trading world this is a non-intersecting caste. Something's going to happen here. And what happens is, beginning almost immediately after we see the federal government being created, George Washington goes out on his horse into Western Pennsylvania, and we've got soldiers coming out. We see the creation again of a US Army in the 1790s to fight against Indigenous people in Ohio. Why is this fight taking place? Because the idea is to make sure get Indigenous people off of land. And once Indigenous people are off land, what can happen to that land? We have a Northwest Ordinance that tells us what's going to happen to that land once it's in the hands of the US government. It's going to be surveyed, subdivided, and sold. So that's what happens here. And that process begins, we can see it in the 1790s, the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. And again, this is an image of that. I find this map really interesting because it's like the other maps that I showed before. You know, the idea that the American territory is overlaid on top of this of Indian territory, except that now we've got this line. And this is the Treaty of Greenville line. And in 1795, then, the US government treats with the Miami and their allies over near Toledo. And at the end of that, they say, you've got to move further north, further west, out of Ohio. We're going to start selling this land or continue to sell land. They've already been doing that. I don't want to overstate that. And so this is the beginning of something really different. After hundreds of years of this colonization that's kind of resting on top of an indigenous country. And that's going to go very quickly. So between 1795 and 1809, and I don't know that this is going to be I don't want it to be too complicated, but let me at least explain. There's the Greenville Treaty line. Every one of these dates refers to a parcel of land, so you can see the boundaries there. We now get real boundaries, and that's the US government having treated with Native Americans in the area. And the treaties are to get Native Americans to leave this area. They are forced to leave the area, and in return for annuities, for land further west, whatever it's going to be, promises are made, and people are moving west. What's interesting for us in this region is that you can see that we're in the center what's the best way? Is it donut? I don't know, but I mean, we're in the center that's still Indian country. That's still indigenous territory in 1809, 1810. And that's really important because along comes somebody who's going to, well, two things. Let's get Fort Dearborn in there too, yes. So Fort Dearborn is a part of the 1795 treaty, and it's going to be put down in the beginning of 1803. It's going to be put up across the river from where the DuSable trading outpost has been. By this time, it's sold to John Kinzie. And so we're looking west in this image. But the point to make here is at this moment in 1803, this is the furthest west fort, the fort furthest west in the United States, because the Louisiana Purchase had not taken place when they started this fort. So when it starts, they're thinking about, oh, we're at the far western edge of the United States, the edge of the Northwest Territory, and then you get the Louisiana Purchase, and suddenly this fort's in the middle of the country instead of all the way west. So there's going to be a real shift in terms of the importance of this space being quickly turned over from indigenous people to the U.S. government. But at any rate, we get Fort Dearborn here then in 1803, and we're Dearborn, Fort Dearborn. And this is the DuSable, the image that we carry around in our heads of the DuSable Kinzie trading outpost. This guy. So this is Tecumseh. Tecumseh is a Shawnee warrior. He and his brother Tenskwatawa, who's has visions, they both say, look, this process, they're looking at 1806, 1807, they're looking at this map where the indigenous people are losing territory to the US that's being surveyed and sold under the Northwest Ordinance. And what they're doing, what the Tecumseh says is, we need to fight this. And to fight this, we have to stand together. And he organizes a pan-Indian movement, often referred to in older texts as a nativist movement, that is getting rid of, shedding all of the things that Euro-Americans had brought to the table in this region, which is a tough sell. You like your cloth, you like your pots, you like your knives. There's lots of reasons why people are people are going to be French plows. There's all kinds of things that people don't want to give up. People want to get up. What Tecumseh says is, give it all up. Not worth it. Let's go back to having this being just indigenous territory. So this sets up the War of 1812. We get the War of 1812 between Great Britain and the United States. It starts in June of 1812. But by that point already, a war had begun in the West between the United States and Tecumseh's forces. And it happens at Tippecanoe. And Tippecanoe is worth keeping in mind. In our region, this is a regional story for us. I think we should hold the Battle of Tippecanoe in November of 1811 as a part of our regional story. So it's down near Purdue on I-65, right? It's near the Tippecanoe Historical Society and all of that. Tippecanoe River. This is Prophetstown. This is where Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa come together to hold to create this pan-Indian movement. And they got villages of people drawn from many different affiliations across the indigenous country. William Henry Harrison comes in November of 1811 and burns these villages. Tecumseh's out of town, and he burns the villages down, and it starts this war. I mean, Tecumseh comes back, and they start plotting when the war is going to begin. And then the U.S. starts this war with Great Britain. Never mind. I'm just going to leave that over to the side. Anybody wants to talk to me about U.S. starting wars that they didn't think through? That's one that used to be at the top of my list. But so quickly, the U.S. forces in this area have to start thinking about, we're going to be at war with Great Britain, which is just up north, right? I mean, this is a seamless border. There, and what you get then at Chicago is a battle in August of 1812 called the Battle of Fort Dearborn. And that really is, and I think we should be thinking about it in terms of this battle between an indigenous place and the model that the US is offering in the Northwest Ordinance, of this new kind of a place. And it's not just, the British egging on Native peoples to do this. This is really something that is trying to halt just this onslaught of the US taking land and moving into this territory. The Potawatomi and their allies here win the Battle of Fort Dearborn. They lose the war really badly. This does not go well for Tecumseh is killed fighting alongside the British outside of Detroit. But this is not a story where, we'll just, there's a lot of violence. There's a lot of people who are killed at this. And why it's interesting that there's a lot of discussion about women and children being killed by Potawatomi and their allies at the spot. And one of the things that I've really wrestled with over the years with the people who are killed in this battle, and it's because there are women and children exiting the fort, which is being evacuated to send people to Fort Wayne. The women and children really represent what the Northwest Ordinance is bringing. Those are the farmers. Those are the folks that are coming in and taking this land and they're going to stay in this region rather than traders, TRADERSs. And so it's brutal, and there is no question about its brutality, but it also is somewhat understandable what's going on there. Because the women and children represent this vanguard of the US pushing into this region in a very different way than the traders, the colonial traders had taken place before. Archangel Wilmette winds up being one of my heroines in this story because she, of course, helps pretty much everyone who comes to her door. She stays at her house next door to, across the river from the fort, and she helps both her grandfather, who's a Potawatomi warrior in this fight, who's fighting against the US government, and she hides and protects members of the commander's family. And again, she sees this in a very different way than the folks, the Americans do, and that Tecumseh does. She sees this as what she wants this world to stay as an indigenous country where people can come in and out. She's got a very different picture of this than others do. The war itself. So in 1812, then Chicago on August 15th is just one of the series of battles. It's really the big victory for Native Americans in this war. And what happens afterwards is very clearly the donut gets filled in very quickly. So 1816 as the Treaty of St. Louis is the first treaty after the War of 1812 is over, and it cedes. You see A on the map there. A is the canal corridor. In 1816, 1817, Illinois is not yet a state, so it's not a part of that frame of the Northwest. It's a part of the Northwest Territory, but not yet its own state. But it is on the cusp of becoming a state because of the American settlement in the southern part of the state. This canal route is going to be turned over to the state of Illinois. This land. And that land, why does the US government have that land to turn over to the state of Illinois when they become a state to create this canal, to create the canal? They've got it because they've taken this land in the Treaty of St. Louis after this unsuccessful war in 1812. But what you see here then between 1816 and 1833 is that virtually all of the land in this region that had been that was under Native American control is now going to go to the US government, which means that what will happen, it's going to be surveyed, subdivided, and sold. And that's the story, I guess. That's shifting this whole story. Fort Dearborn, which is burned after the Battle of Fort Dearborn in 1812, is rebuilt. And what happens during many of these later the treaties as they go on in the 1820s is you start to see parcels of land. Archangel Med's family gets a parcel of land. Someone like Billy Caldwell will get it's now a golf course, will get a parcel of this land. And they will then be a part of a different kind of a system rather than this older, longer tradition of a trading network. They now are landowners and provisional landowners. Let me say that. If you want to hear more about any of these stories, that most of them are unable, mixed descent people are unable to hold this land. And then we're to where I started studying Chicago history, which is that map. Because that's the first plat map for our region. This is at the mouth of the Chicago River. It's the map that the Illinois and Michigan Canal Commissioners create. And that map, again, spurs me to think about real estate and how real estate underlies so much of the development. Well, we know that's, I'm not saying anything profound there. Real estate is going to move us forward in lots of interesting ways. And following real estate is interesting. And it's one of those moments that I was well into the encyclopedia project, and it's like, this map is from the very same year. And it's reminding us that even in 1830, that Native Americans lived on this landscape that was already being subdivided and sold. And so the last piece of this story then in the early 1830s, we can see through someone like Black Hawk. So Black Hawk is a Sauk warrior. The Sauk have ceded their land in a treaty that goes back to 1803 at St. Louis, and their lands in western Illinois along the Mississippi River. The Sauk villages are larger agricultural villages. They'll get up to 2,000 people in a village in the summertime, so they're bigger than the Potawatomi. But at any rate, they come back in 1831. In 1831, they come back to in the late spring and summer. The women come back to farm the fields that they have traditionally farmed. And they find American settlers in their farm fields. And that's really the impetus for Black Hawk's call for another war. And the Black Hawk War doesn't get much traction in this area from the Potawatomi and their allies, because many of them remembered what happened in 1812 and were unwilling to do that. And they also saw, or there were people who understood that what was going to happen here was the U.S. was going to come in, and they wanted to cut as good a deal as they could. So it's Black Hawk is most of the fighting is going to take place in the north. Black Hawk isn't there. Black Hawk has been captured early in this process. But what the end result of all of this is that we get a removal from Potawatomi from this broader region that starts. The last treaty is in 1833 after the Black Hawk War. And this removal takes place over a number of years. It's led by the U.S. Army. So this is not a gentle removal. This is a removal where you're moving with the U.S. Army. The first stop was supposed to be Missouri. When they get to Missouri, the Potawatomi find out that the state of Missouri, which is not interested in having Potawatomi moved into their state. So they have to move to Iowa. And some of them will stay in Iowa, but many of the Potawatomi will get pushed out of Iowa as well. They'll land in Kansas. So if any of you know your Civil War history, you can think of Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. That's tied to the Potawatomi from this region who wind up in Kansas and then Oklahoma. So the Prairie Band Potawatomi that are now in Oklahoma are part of this exodus. So we think about, and we teach, and maybe I'll stop there, we teach the Trail of Tears nationally as that story. And it's this Cherokee Trail of Tears. This is a story that takes place over and over and over and over again. We use the Cherokees and we pull that story out, but the Potawatomi removal and the Trail of Tears, and that's how the Potawatomi surely describe it today, goes on here, and it's the same that you're gonna find in different regions, again, in different areas across the country as we go along. And what is this tied to? It's really tied to the Northwest Ordinance and a vision, a frame for what what the world is gonna look like using government, yeah, exactly right. I'll stop there. Happy to take questions. I'd love to hear what you think. Yeah.